Hello and welcome to Professor Patrick Roberts from Germany, who has recently authored the book Jungle, published by Penguin in 14 chapters and approximately 400 pages. Professor Patrick Roberts, welcome. And would you mind introducing yourself and what department you're working at in Germany?
Yeah, no, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm currently a research group leader within the Department of Archaeology at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Jena in Germany. And in our institute, we try and apply various scientific methods to the study of the human past to try and better understand how our species has adapted to different environments, changed different environments, and how the past might be relevant to today.
So it actually combines history, archaeology with things to do with conservation and biodiversity.
Exactly, yes. The aim is really to try and bridge the social and natural sciences and get the most complete picture of the past we possibly can.
Now, the word jungle apparently turns up in the English language around 1776 and implies something that kind of like dense growth, dry wasteland, uncultivated ground. But you're trying to show that actually the jungle is not really a forbidding place like that.
Yes, exactly. I think this word, the jungle, that was obviously taken from the British during their time in India. It originally derives from Hindi jangle and then even more deeper time Sanskrit. And they really seem to have taken this word and used it to start describing kind of tropical forest wilderness. And really in our own contemporary thought, in the media, and even in more academic context, this word jungle has come to characterize tropical forests as this very homogeneous, wild, inhospitable environment, as we can see in books like The Jungle Book, for example, the idea being that in these habitats, only animals can really thrive, and they're really separate to human society.
Now, the thing is that how would you define, now, firstly, probably it's a good thing that you didn't call it tropical forests because there are lots of books called tropical forests. It's probably good that you called it jungle. What's your definition of the forests that we're talking about? Because in recent times, there has been a trend to even describe British wet forests, particularly in the Southwest, as, for example, Atlantic rainforest. Would you confine yourself mainly to the tropics? Is it wet and dry forests or just wet forests?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in the start of the book, I point out that there are these two different definitions or types of definitions for tropical forests. Some people like to use kind of climatic parameters. So for things like rainforest, that's a certain amount of rainfall, a certain temperature, and a certain lack of seasonality throughout the year can be used to define a tropical rainforest. And those climatic definitions are interesting because they can then be applied to the past when more of the world's surface would have had a tropical-like climate. For example, there are various times when mangroves have extended into the British Isles, where what they've become known as megathermal kind of rainforests have extended into the northern and southern hemisphere. So that's one set of definitions that can be really useful to look at deep time. And within those definitions, climatically, you can start to get these rainforests in Britain. They're not necessarily the same as tropical rainforests. They're slightly different climates, but they're within the precipitation requirements, they do meet these kind of criteria. But the definition I end up using is actually a very broad definition, which basically says any forest within the tropics. So that's any forest growing between the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer. And this can really be, as you say, it can be very dry forests that are quite arid for parts of the year, maybe even losing a lot of their leaves at that time, right up to montane tropical forests in places like New Guinea that can actually see ice and frost in parts of the year, as well as, of course, the more classic lowland tropical rainforests. And the idea here is to try and highlight the variability of the forests in the tropics that our species and its ancestors must have got to grips with in the past.
Professor Roberts, I think it's interesting that we're talking about tropical forests and why tropical forests should be of relevance to, for example, right now we're in Europe, why it should be of relevance to people in Europe. And I can remember when tropical forests were in the news from the 1980s. And indeed, there is a Pet Shop Boys song that actually refers to forest loss. So clearly in 1988, when this song came out, this was something that was part of people's consciousness alongside saving whales and things like that. So it's not that jungles have been out of people's minds since before that, but it actually started hitting the news in the 80s, and for the past 40 or so years, we have been having lots and lots of information and news coming up about the loss of forests, but things don't seem to have changed much since the 1980s, I'm afraid. So this topic remains as vital as ever, doesn't it?
Yes, no, that's a really good point. I mean, they were really a strong part, as you say, of that kind of green movement that really began strongly in the 1980s. And I think for a long time, there has been this fascination in the public at, the types of animals and amazing plants that we see in tropical forests, right? Regular David Attenborough documentaries. We're happy to sit on our sofas and really see, oh, wow, that's absolutely fascinating. Even ecotourism, right, for people living in Europe and North America is quite powerful in trying to provide romantic perceptions of these environments. But the problem is, I think, that ever since then, they've always still seemed somewhat exotic, right? It might seem very sad that they're disappearing, but that somehow has remained kind of abstract to us, particularly those of us living in Europe and North America, where we can see this perhaps happening, but somehow it either doesn't seem real or it doesn't seem relevant to our day-to-day life. And I think that has somehow allowed us to sleepwalk into a position where there is still masses of tropical forest loss around the world. And it's starting to actually impact our own climates, our own societies in Europe and North America, as well as the societies living in the tropics. Despite this obvious long-term interest, we still haven't really got to grips with trying to come up with global solutions to protect them.
Yes, and hopefully in the course of this discussion, we will try to highlight why the tropical jungles are of such relevance to the West as well. And it's not just to do with global warming, it's to do with what we enjoy in our foods and in coffee shops. But I mean, a lot of your book is history and deep time. You say that tropical forests have been around a thousand times more than we have been around. You start your book from about 538 million years ago in the Cambrian, and there's that vast amount of time, particularly from the Carboniferous, that's covered. So we deal with things like the Permo-Triassic mass extinction. Now, at that time, there's an argument, isn't there, that the world became anoxic and the sea got stratified, and there was so much sulfur underneath that layer of anoxic layer that some of it might have come up and caused an extinction. To what extent are forests connected with extinctions at that time?
Yeah, I mean, I think this very early period is fascinating. I start in the Cambrian looking at the very first plants on Earth and what they might have started to change to our planet. And, that is very much occurring in what we might call a tropical world. The climate is incredibly warm, it's humid. And the first land plants are really emerging in that environment in the Cambrian. There are now studies that show even these very simple plants could have started eroding rock to produce soils, having also a significant impact on the atmosphere. And by the Ordovician, there is already this argument that actually these first land plants are impacting the world to an extent that they're changing the oceans. They're causing a flood of nutrients into the water that is eventually leading to extinction events because marine food chains are growing, expanding, and they're overusing the oxygen that's in the water, leading to then mass die-off. And this then seems to occur again, then in the Devonian, you have some of the first trees emerging, which change the world. They act as these kind of planetary engineers to an even greater extent. And then in the Carboniferous, what we have is what are the first true tropical forests, in the sense that they're forests growing in the tropics and covering a lot of the Earth's surface in the tropics. And these forests are actually the ones that produce many of the coal beds. Kind of ironically, that's where the name the Carboniferous comes from, is that these woody trees they're sort of dying, they're decomposing, and that carbon's getting locked away. And over millions of years of pressure is leading to the production of coal. And it's actually those layers that have been used since the Industrial Revolution to burn fossil fuels. And as trees and these forests, they have even bigger impacts on the planet, bigger impacts on the atmosphere and the Earth's surface, that in turn actually did lead to conditions that could have massive ramifications for the planet. The Permo-Triassic itself is actually one of only two mass extinctions of plants. So actually, even the changing atmosphere, the changing global conditions as a result of plants could actually lead to the plants themselves having to adapt to these new conditions. So certainly, from the very beginning, these plants and trees are changing the world in which we live in, changing the atmosphere and changing what it looked like, causing major upheaval, but fundamentally actually making a surface in which ecosystems could thrive and become what we think of them when we think of kind of complex ecosystems today.
Now, during the Permo-Triassic, there was actually much less forest for a certain time, wasn't there? I mean, after the cool forests died out, there was a very dry phase when all the continents had joined together.
Yeah.
And we understand that at this time, there was probably less forest, or maybe very little forest, maybe except in the southern continents. I don't know, Glossopteris or whatever, I don't think. But then at some point, at this point in time, the flowering plants began at least the initial evolution before the gymnosperms started taking over.
Yes. So yes, no. So the Permo-Triassic itself was yes. This mass extinction was caused by the continents perhaps coming together and then starting to separate, leading to drier conditions that caused this mass death of these rainforests, these carboniferous rainforests that had emerged. And then, having just arrived, it's one of the only periods on the planet where, since trees arrived, that you then have nearly a complete absence of forests. What actually then happens after that, it's actually the way around, is that the gymnosperms appear first. So with their seeds, this was a kind of, gymnosperm means naked seed, and we're talking things like conifers. And they really, this seed concept allows them to actually survive through difficult conditions and only germinate, as we know today, when conditions are a little bit better. And so when forests come back in the Triassic period, as we see when we watch documentaries about dinosaurs, what you start to have are these gymnosperm dominated forests, lots of conifers that really develop as these first forests. And then a bit later, perhaps as early as the Jurassic, but really expanding in the Cretaceous, we start to see angiosperms, which are the flowering plants that really are the plants we think of when we think of our gardens today. Most plants that we eat, most plants around the world, and most plants in tropical forests are these angiosperms that then appear and expand around the world incredibly rapidly, particularly during the Cretaceous, and start to then dominate new tropical forests that really would have started to look like the tropical forests as we know them today by the end of the Cretaceous, and certainly as we enter into the Paleocene era.
Professor Roberts, now the evolution of the angiosperms has to be one of the most important revolutions in the history of biodiversity, because not only do they provide lots of nutrients to various animals, they also started a dramatic relationship, a deep relationship with insects and other creatures for pollination and seed dispersal. So it's of vital consequence to modern day civilization, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's one of, I think, the most interesting questions in paleobotany is when and where did these angiosperms originate? There seems to be a hypothesis that perhaps they emerged on really wet, warm tropical forest floors, but other theories suggest maybe it happened in a slightly drier setting. But as soon as they emerge, generally thought to be the Cretaceous, though there is some recent work that suggests they might have already emerged as early as the Jurassic. But they expand incredibly rapidly in the Cretaceous. And as you say, this appears to be linked to mutualistic relationships, particularly with insects, is generally the theory probably favored right now. Although there was this intriguing theory that they were actually linked to dinosaurs, particular types of dinosaur species during the Cretaceous, that they might have facilitated the emergence of angiosperms. There does seem like there might be a very weak relationship between certain dinosaur species, but I think for now, people are very much settled more on the insects argument. And yes, it completely changed the planet. It can change what tropical forests look like. And ultimately, it changed the types of resources all over the world available to humans and hominins when they went to eventually emerge as well.
Now, just for my interest as well, I mean, if we kind of look at a broad overview of the modern day tropical forests, we can see that South America and Australia and New Zealand still have significant components of the Mesozoic flora, don't they? And or even in Southeast Asia, we've got plants like a neem, which is sort of like a cross between a gymnosperm and an angiosperm. So it's not like tropical forests are homogeneous. There seems to be a kind of broad amount of homogeneity in like, for example, South America and Africa, and possibly parts of Asia. But in the southern continents, you have a representation of some of this Mesozoic flora.
Yes, exactly. I think this gets back, the idea that in jungle, I was trying to encapsulate not only this idea that all tropical forest is wilderness, but also that all tropical forests are the same. And actually, we can very clearly that's not the case, that they've had very dramatic geological history. The first trees emerged in the tropical world, then you have the Carboniferous rainforests, then you have gymnosperm forests in the tropics, and then you have angiosperm forests. And as you say, ever since the gymnosperms, they've sort of been pushed mainly, as you mentioned, to sort of New Zealand, these kind of conifer forests that existed. So they're not so much in the tropics, but as you say, there are also certainly elements that persist in certain parts of the tropics as well, that have this long legacy. And particularly then when the angiosperms arrive, you get different species that then have very different interactions, right? So you have the movement of the continents changing relationships. So the Dipterocarpaceae, for example, those trees seem to have gone on this very long journey, with Sri Lanka and India hitting into Asia, Southeast Asia, and then spreading through there. So that's a fascinating group of trees that really has this deep geological linkage. And it's, we see species being exchanged between different parts of the tropics or not exchanged as the continents sort of separated or joined each other. And yes, exactly. I think the geological history of tropical forests is fascinating. All the time, climate is changing where tropical forests are found, how expansive they are. They're waxing and waning in and out from the equator as the climate also changes through this period. And at part you have rainforests across most of tropical warm rainforests across most of Europe that then wax and retreat right back to the equator. So you have this really fascinating geological history showing that tropical forests didn't just arrive and then stay the same. They're very dynamic, very complex, and also very diverse as well.
Okay, we're going to be crossing over a huge amount of history, prehistory, that you have covered in your book to do with, for example, the evolution of the mammals and very interesting fossil discoveries that have been made, to come to pre-human history. I don't really know exactly what the word is, but we're talking about humans at the time that they were spreading out of Africa and taking over the rest of the world. And this brings us to lots of interesting work that you have done in Sri Lanka, which suggests that there were humans in the rainforests of Sri Lanka 40,000 years ago.
Yeah, so I mean, there's first, the hominin ancestors evolved in tropical forests about 8 million years ago in Africa. But by about 300,000 years ago, we see our species emerging in Africa. So we have Homo sapiens. Human history has very emphatically began. It then looks like humans disperse out of Africa, perhaps as early as 200,000 years ago, but there's kind of failed dispersals. And then the really big dispersal seems to occur somewhere between 160 or 40,000 years ago. And as you mentioned, as part of this, humans start to get into the tropics of Asia. Having begun in Africa, they now hit tropical forests in different parts of Asia. And Sri Lanka is very close to my heart because it's where I did my doctorate. And Sri Lanka was fascinating because at a time when archaeologists were basically saying humans must have avoided tropical forests, right? That they like to follow grassland corridors, or they followed these coastal highways all the way from Africa around to Australia. And so Sri Lanka was fascinating because the Sri Lankan archaeologists, I'm thinking here of P.E.P. Deraniyagala, and then followed by his son Siran Deraniyagala, were showing that the earliest human fossils in Sri Lanka and the earliest, these fascinating tools called microliths, were actually found in sites in the middle of tropical rainforests. And actually the microliths, which are these very small stone tools that were often linked to kind of projectile technology, seem to be older than those found in Europe. And the global archaeological community at the time assumed that the work in Sri Lanka must be wrong, as that kind of colonial history of the discipline really, acted in a very negative manner there. But actually, ultimately, they have been shown to be correct, that actually these sites now go back as far as 45, maybe even 50,000 years ago in Sri Lanka. And what our work wanted to do was, so people could argue, okay, so you have these sites in the rainforest, but perhaps there wasn't rainforest in the past, or perhaps humans were moving, so between the more kind of open areas of Sri Lanka, the coasts, and then just spending a little time in the rainforest. And so what I did as part of my doctorate is we applied this geochemical approach to human teeth, stable isotope analysis. And stable isotope analysis, we can use it to distinguish between resources being eaten in the forest in the tropics and resources being eaten in more open areas. And what we found was that the earliest human sample we had at that time, I think, was 38,000 years old, that human was clearly using tropical rainforest resources from first arrival. This continued through the Pleistocene, it continued through even into the late Holocene. And the only two humans that we saw that had this more open signal actually came from the Iron Age, when millet agriculture, millet is a crop that has this kind of open signal, moved into the rainforest. And even then, humans were still relying on the forest at that time. And so Sri Lanka was amazing in this context, because this work really contributed to that work that had already been pioneered by the Sri Lankan archaeologists to show not only could humans live in a rainforest environment as early as their first arrival in them, but they were actually choosing to. They were actually very much living there all year round, and they developed this incredibly sophisticated adaptation. They were hunting monkeys, they were hunting giant squirrels that you can see in Sri Lanka today. They were using Canarium nuts, maybe they were even using wild banana. And it's this remarkable strategy, and it really completely overturned kind of stereotypical ideas of where humans would choose to go. And even showed that things like bow and arrow were developed in Sri Lanka earlier than in Europe. So, you know, it really is a remarkable place that has overturned a lot of our preconceptions.
For my clarification, you mentioned Canarium nuts. What are Canarium nuts?
And these are the nuts from the tree Canarium species.
Still around today?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. It's probably one of these rainforest nuts.
Yes, I can. Canarium zeylanicum.
Okay. Okay.
Well, yeah, I mean, so they can't identify the exact species in the past, but we know that it's a nut that exactly a rainforest tree nut. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you said that these people were living in the rainforests until the Holocene. So until about what time is that?
Yeah, so well into, I mean, the last set of isotope samples we had was from 3,000 years ago. So that's the time I'm talking about there. But of course, you have the Vanuatu, the Veda of Sri Lanka, and they were most certainly still living in forests as well as other places in the island. Certainly right up to well, they still do. But, you know, it looks like British colonialism then changed a lot of their access to these resources. And that has kind of continued, where they're not currently allowed to hunt in forests like they traditionally used to, but arguably you have a legacy of humans hunting and using forests in Sri Lanka right up to the present day.
Now, we don't really have quite so much evidence, unfortunately, from certain other parts of the world from this time of human history, but we do understand that it is at this time, we're talking, shall we say, 10,000 years ago, or quite an unknown period of time, when many modern day plants and animals were domesticated, including, for example, chickens from the Oriental region and the bananas, and presumably in many other parts of the world, like South America, lots of modern day eatables were being domesticated from rainforest habitats.
Yeah, so certainly by the Holocene, 10,000 years ago, we have humans really starting to use and manipulate rainforests and tropical forests in ways that we don't see before that. There is very early evidence for humans perhaps practicing burning to manage tropical forest environments, perhaps even moving animals between rainforests as a source of protein. But it's really in the Holocene where we start to see examples of cultivation. Some of the earliest examples is in New Guinea, this site called Cook Swamp, where you see banana, taro, yams being brought together in kind of drained areas as a sort of cultivation set. In Sri Lanka or Southeast Asia, you know, the origins of the chicken. We think of the chicken as the most numerous, you know, domesticated animal in the world now. And it originates from the jungle fowl, which is wild in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. And so we have a scenario, and then maize also is a tropical crop. It was first, seems to have been cultivated in lowland, warm valleys in Mexico. And so it was often thought that tropical forests are terrible places for agriculture, right? We think of that, if we think of our current practices, it often leads to deforestation to grow things in these regions. But actually, we have increasing examples from all over the world of humans practicing quite complex mixed approaches of cultivating different crops in tropical forests, not cutting the whole forest down, often in very mobile systems, mixed systems where they're using wild and domesticated resources at the same time. And some of the things that we rely upon most in our daily shopping, weekly shopping routines, like the chicken, actually originate from tropical forests as well.
Well, for my own interest, I've picked up that the so-called Australian Aborigines were responsible for burning off vast amounts of Australian forests. To what extent is this true? I mean, this certainly led to the extinction of lots of various large marsupial animals in Australia. Keeping in mind that Australia is, after all, a continent, to what extent was a lot of forest lost in Australia to create the modern-day desert ecosystems?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So obviously, yes, the first human arrivals in Australia have been linked to this process of megafaunal extinction. There's a real hot debate still going today. Was that climate? Was it humans? And as part of this, as you say, some more indirect assertions of human impact has been this idea that they burned forests, leading to aridification. Now, one of the more sad outcomes of these arguments is that traditional burning has actually been locked out, or was locked out, of certain forests. So like the wet tropics of Queensland, it was actually forbidden. But actually, I think what we clearly see in archaeology, paleoecology, and ethnohistory now is that indigenous burning did not just destroy forests. They didn't do that. It was actually much more complex. It involved low-level burning to clear forest floors so that movement was easier. It involved kind of burning certain patches of forest so that there were kind of actually fire-resistant parts of the forest that could stop massive wildfires. And so actually what happened is when this was banned, you actually had a buildup of all this vegetation on the forest floor. And now you've had climate change, it creates this tinderbox. And it's actually led to wildfires sweeping through rainforests that were thought to never be able to burn. So actually, I think we've mischaracterized Aboriginal burning practices. And that's actually, they were actually critical to forest health and forest dynamics in parts of Australia. And that actually, we've seen that by sort of repressing some of these practices, it can lead to very unintended negative consequences. And so I actually think it's very unlikely that Aboriginal populations destroyed forests. I actually think that their practices were clearly very finely tuned to maintaining biodiversity, to maintaining different types of forests that were actually helping them not only to gain food, but also maintaining a certain forest health, a certain forest resilience to extreme events.
So we can move now towards the medieval period. Now, clearly there was probably a lot of retreat of rainforests at the end of the Ice Age, when lots of land that was probably covered by forest got submerged. But you had all these wonderful civilizations turning up, unfortunately not very documented, but were based on archaeology in South America, Southeast Asia, and also Sri Lanka. And we can talk about the Asian ones later on, because we probably know a little bit more about them. But these South American forest garden sorts of networks, that's very interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, so again, there's been the same thing. Like with agriculture, it's been assumed that cities in tropical forests were kind of impossible, right? Because we see them today, we see that cities have this big impact, and so they must not have been sustainable. And so the example of the classic Maya in Central America, they've been used as a case of collapse, right? That they must have eventually failed, because you can't have cities like ours supposedly in tropical forests. But what we've actually found doing more and more investigation, actually consulting with indigenous communities, as you say, there's very clearly examples around the world in the tropics for very complex urban networks. If we want to start in the classic Maya, for example, it was once assumed that they must be very compact cities like ours. Like you have temples, and it's very intense, heavily populated, and so it's very easy to overuse the landscape. But applying methods like LiDAR, which is this laser scanning from the air, is showing that actually they were quite dispersed, they were quite spread out, and agrarian activities were combined within these urban networks. You had orchards, you had mobile fields, you had causeways, pathways, water networks that were actually creating this quite dispersed network that actually made them quite resilient to change, and meant that a lot of forest cover was still being maintained. Similarly, in the Amazon Basin was a classic example of where it was truly assumed that agriculture and urbanism must be impossible. But actually here in the last sort of 20 years, there's been a lot of discovery of what these now called so-called garden cities, where you have networks of different settlements coming together, some perhaps relying on more wild tree management, others on fields of maize or manioc, even the management of kind of freshwater resources like turtles and even ducks. And this is then making a lot of population that in the Amazon, there are now estimates that think at the time of European arrival, there might have been as many as 20 million people living across the Amazon basin, which would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. But yes, no, basically up and down the tropics in the Americas, as you say, also in Asia, there are these cases, even when the Aztec Empire, the Triple Alliance Empire, the capital is technically just within the tropics. It just about stays in there. And if you think about there, when Europeans arrived, they were in awe at the amazing things these cities had to offer. And that was probably also true in Asia as well. For example, Greater Angkor was the largest urban network ever to have existed in pre-industrial times, far larger than Rome, far larger than Constantinople, and any of the ancient Chinese cities. It was massive. And you have examples, as you say, in India, in Sri Lanka, Polonnaruwa, Anuradhapura, particularly, are other examples of this kind of dispersed urban strategy where you likely had agrarian activities combined with orchards, tree management, as well as those big temple structures and more urban kind of state-like buildings as well. So yeah, it seems like across the tropics,
Well, I think that it's very nice to consider this development of something that sounds like sustainable agroforestry in many of these civilizations. But isn't it also true to say that, for example, somebody like John Still, who has written Jungle Tide about Sri Lanka, he effectively says that the cultivation of rice and the agricultural activities would have actually caused a kind of ebbing away of forests. And like when people disappeared, the forest returned, and when people started doing their things, the forest ebbed away. Isn't it true that many civilizations, especially the rice-dependent civilizations, destroyed lots of forests and also relied on the water that effectively came downstream from the forests? But didn't they actually destroy forests in order to establish these vast agricultural civilizations as well?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And, this is our idea that cities and when they're using these crops, they really do a monoculture like we imagine today. So with the classic Maya, it's maize. In the case of Greater Angkor or Sri Lanka, it's rice. And certainly to some extent, particularly with rice, there clearly does have to be a huge concern with water. You see that in Sri Lanka, those cities, Polonnaruwa and Anuradhapura, there is a clear obsession with trying to control water to grow rice because it is so important for it. And so I think particularly in dry areas, seasonally dry areas like Angkor and Sri Lanka, there is, of course, a very delicate balance between having these very large populations producing lots of rice and dealing with seasonal climates, in the dry zone of Sri Lanka, for example, but also in the drier forests of Greater Angkor. So I think that's certainly true to an extent, and rice obviously will also have impacts on soils, the same as maize. But I would also caution that by saying that so, for example, in the Ifugao terraces in the Philippines that might be familiar to lots of people, that's often taken as a classic case where rice comes in and it leads to massive forest destruction, right? That you get these beautiful terraces, but that they must have led to forest destruction. But actually, when you look at the historical and ethnographic evidence, as part of these terraces, the local communities actually almost always keep forest at the top of those areas because they know that you need forest there, as you say, for water, but also to stabilize the soils. And so actually, rice in that case is still part of a very complex system. It's true that in cases in southern China, as rice expands, it does seem to be heavily linked to a lot of deforestation. But I think what I'm trying to say is that doesn't always have to be the case. And actually, in places like Anuradhapura and Polonnaruwa, we actually still have incredibly poor understanding of the paleoecological change. We actually don't really know how environments change. For so long, there's been a discussion that those cities failed due to invasion, right? That's the usual narrative, also based on historical records. But there also must have been facing climatic challenges as well. And as you say, maybe even challenges with the growing of rice that itself brought. But we actually don't know that yet. So that's one of the projects we're currently working on, is to try and get a better understanding of how climate changed in these parts of the tropics and how human activities might have contributed to environmental change as well.
So this kind of leads us towards the modern day world. Now, 500 years ago, the Spanish came to South America, and they, at least with the case of the Aztecs, they discovered this flourishing, wonderful city in the middle of a canal network in Mexico. And from that point onwards, there are these waves of destruction and the disappearance of indigenous people, often because of diseases that were introduced. Now, how many people probably died out in South America? 100 million? I mean, you said 20 million earlier, so maybe 100 million is an exaggeration.
Well, so that was 20 million for the Amazon. I mean, I think the numbers we're talking about are huge. There was the latest paper I've seen was by Koch et al. In 2019. They estimated that 90% of the indigenous population across the Americas died out within 100 years from repeated waves of disease That probably isn't too shy of 100 million people, depending on the estimates you use. Certainly, it's the worst public health disaster ever recorded. I mean, if we think about COVID, how that's changed our lives, but if you think about the death rate of COVID relative to 90% of the population being killed, right? This is very clearly huge orders of magnitude worse for the indigenous populations of the Americas. And it really would have had dramatic impacts on the societies that existed there, the economies, and of course, then the environments that they'd been interacting with.
Yes, but this was also a time when tropical crops were moved around more than ever before, probably thanks to the Portuguese, and they were moving around what we take for granted now in terms of pan-tropical fruits and vegetables were moved around very largely from South America all around the rest of the world. Things like chilies and potatoes came to Europe, but lots of other things like cashews, pawpaw, and guava, and maybe in another direction mangoes. So there was this flourishing understanding of the richness of what the tropical world can actually provide the whole world. I mean, like coffee and chocolate and stuff like that.
Yes, exactly. I mean, this was a time where these diseases traveled as a product of these growing international networks, and the Spanish and Portuguese, what they did is they really created the first pan-tropical networks. They had, especially when they were combined, they had areas in Africa, South America, Central America, the Caribbean, and even Southeast Asia, with the Philippines as the center of the Spanish East Indies. And this not only led to things being moved within the tropics, but also out of the tropics into Europe, as you say. So you have, sheep and goats and cattle arriving in the tropics that have their own environmental impacts. But you also have these tropical plants, vanilla, chocolate, as you mentioned, tea, coffee, chilies, and even as you met the potato, it is from the tropics, albeit very high altitude. And these start going around the world and changing cuisines, and some of them even start to become cash crops, which becomes very problematic in then what happens next. But yeah, certainly you have this huge exchange in cuisines in the tropics really being linked into the rest of the world. This is really when that begins.
Now, rightly or wrongly, the South America has been described as the Americas were described as the new world because it was discovered by the Europeans as a completely new set of continents. Can we like compare the Amazon and the Congo or possibly some other tropical forest and say which one's more important? My understanding is that the largest river in the world, freshwater river, is the Amazon. And we're not just talking about the freshwater river on the ground, we're also talking about a freshwater river in the sky, as highlighted by recent programs where vast amounts of water are shipped through the sky because of the transpiration from these forests. Does this make the Amazon theoretically more significant, or are these transpiration cycles very important all around the whole world from all these tropical forests?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, the Amazon is the largest area of tropical forest. So, in some ways it is the most important, but actually a lot of those processes are happening in all tropical forests. So as you say, tropical forests are critical because they're incredible carbon sinks, or at least they were. It's terrifyingly starting to change. Yeah. But they also, as you say, transpiration in the tropical forests contributes to massive amounts of water that form as clouds and then provide rain. And actually, if the Amazon was to be destroyed, for example, you would not only drastically reduce rainfall in South America, but you would actually reduce rainfall in North America, Europe, as a result of these climate systems. The same is true of the Congo Basin. If you remove the forest of the Congo Basin, you would also dramatically reduce rainfall based on modeling in parts of North Africa, extending into Europe, and perhaps even into Central Asia. And also the Congo Basin has these incredibly important peat swamp forests that store a huge amount of carbon in the same way that the Southeast Asian peat swamp forests do. So actually, in some ways, in parts of the carbon cycle, they might even be more important than the Amazon, particularly as the Amazon is on the cusp of already changing its carbon sink status. So I would say it's complex. I think all tropical forests are incredibly valuable in different ways, and they're all interlocked into these earth systems. They're critical for rainfall, for the carbon cycle, for biodiversity, and each one will offer something a little bit different, but I think all inherently critical to our planet.
So we're coming towards our time now. Now, to what extent would you say, and this is just almost like a contentious point, and I don't necessarily believe that there's any truth for it, but to what extent has there been more tropical forest destruction in the short space of the 20th century compared to when this kind of globalization started about 500 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I think the 20th century certainly did see the most tropical deforestation. That's quite undeniable. I think a lot of it, the tone was set in the 17th, 16th, and 18th centuries, where you had this arrival of a European idea that land should be put to the greatest use of profit possible, right? And if that meant deforesting it so that you could plant your cash crops, then so be it. That was kind of the attitude, that this land is what had the value rather than necessarily the forest. And this really then continued in global international systems into the 20th century, where you have huge deforestation for timber, for conversion into ranching land, conversion into cash crop land. That continues apace into the 20th century. And thanks to industrial methods, it becomes more efficient. It happens on a wider scale. More parts of the forest can be accessed, and it just keeps increasing. But I would argue that a lot of those extractive practices do have their roots in these early colonial activities, which I think is something we forget. Alex Moulton has a fascinating set of articles where he argues how a plantation logic extends all the way from slavery in the Caribbean. And I think we often forget these legacies of colonialism when we consider the plight of the tropics today, and when we consider that perhaps we see them as separate to ourselves, but actually a lot of the issues and challenges they're facing have their origins in a kind of European colonialism that really entwine the tropics with the rest of the world.
Well, at the risk of sounding controversial, to what extent has the treatment of Indonesia as a single country been problematic for Southeast Asian rainforests, considering that the so-called Dutch East Indies were actually separate kingdoms that were unified by the Dutch, and then it was all bundled together as this independent state. And recently we have seen vast amounts of deforestation thanks to palm oil. To what extent has the changes of boundaries contributed to forest loss like that? I mean, particularly in the Indonesian context.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, Indonesia obviously has received a lot of blame for the destruction of heat swamp forests and unlicensed palm oil regulation expansion. But ultimately, again, it's those global pressures that are of the market. I mean, as it was shown, a lot of the palm oil funding was coming from prominent multinational companies. A lot of it was unlicensed, and it's hard to say that this is all one nation's fault. And actually, at the time of those big fires, a lot of the neighboring countries did blame Indonesia, but Indonesia pointed out that actually there was a lot of deforestation going on in many of these other parts of the world as well. Certainly, I mean, it can even change within regimes, right? Brazil had an amazing it really slowed down destruction of the Amazon over a period of a decade that actually offset the increase in Southeast Asia, so that, in a certain set of 2 decades, the overall global tropical forest deforestation didn't change that much. But obviously with the new Brazilian regime, that's all actually reversed again. And so now we're in a really problematic state where you have actually an increase in deforestation again in that critical area. And so, yes, this can vary between regimes, it can vary between nations, but I think ultimately the only reason that works is because the global market has pressures to produce the cheapest cash crops possible, to feed consumer desires in Europe and North America and parts of China. That is what is driving, the people living in these countries. They're trying to make money, they're trying to survive. And yes, perhaps they are directly responsible for some of that deforestation, but ultimately the pressures that are being placed on them, and also the increasing pressures of climate change, are not, shouldn't be laid solely at their doorstep.
If I can bring something, I mean, that not many people appreciate in Western Europe now. I mean, in the 2000s, they decided to ban feeding waste food to pigs for health and safety reasons because of swine flu, and this meant that pigs had to be fed by importing soya from tropical rainforests. Now, feeding domesticated animals, including pigs, I think it was a tragedy that they banned feeding waste food to pigs, which made pigs actually quite sustainable. Which one is worse? So that you got soya. I mean, we started off with things like sugar, and then you've got bananas, and then you've got soya, and then you've got now you've got palm oil, and then you also got gold mining. Which one is worse, or are they all just as bad? I mean, it seems to be just one worse thing after another coming up as an excuse to carry on destroying these forests.
Yeah, I mean, that's another good point. We see these big discussions in Europe. Is it better to be vegetarian? You look at the impact of your food on landscapes, and obviously things like inorganic beef has the biggest impact on environments in that context, on emissions and things. But as you say, soya bean, which makes up a lot of tofu, can actually, when it's grown in very mass scale in the Amazon, can have huge impacts on rainforests and carbon emissions that actually can be even worse than certain meats you might eat. And so we do have to be careful. The same is true of palm oil. Per kilogram of palm oil produced, it's actually less damaging to biodiversity than olive oil and coconut oil. Now, not many people in Europe or North America would ever think that, right? But actually, olive oil is tremendously damaging to biodiversity in terms of per kilogram. And palm oil can actually be grown also very sustainably beyond that when it's not replacing peat swamp forests, but rather being grown on open land. It can actually be incredibly important. And actually, ever since the Holocene, it was grown in Africa in these remarkable agroforestry systems. And so what I would again say is none of these things are inherently bad. It's just the systems that they end up being in, and often these profit-driven systems that don't have as much concern for local sustainability or local food security lead to problems. But actually, all of these things can be grown or used in ways that are far more sustainable. Cattle, for example, in the Philippines, you have water buffalo, and you might have a couple of water buffalo to help you manage or produce milk in your area of land. And that is possible to be within a package, right? And so it's again, what we do with these products rather than necessarily the products themselves, I would say.
I'd just like to bring in this point. I mean, like, there's this religion in the modern day West that so many people in the world don't understand, which is veganism. Is veganism a solution to saving the rainforest?
Yeah, I mean, again, if veganism based on soybean that's grown in very bad ways, then no. But in theory, of course, plants are easier. A plant-based diet should have less of an impact on the environment. And of course, you have increasingly lab-based diets as well. That your food can be grown in a lab, and also insects. Insects are seen as a protein source that could be very sustainable as well. It's possible, but again, I would caution that it's not necessarily the complete entire way of life, but it's where those crops are coming from. And so it actually matters when we're in a supermarket that we look at where exactly our products are coming from, that we do a bit of research. And even with organic things, sometimes organic products can have bad impacts on local indigenous communities because they often drive them out of their own traditional approaches to the landscape. So we have to be careful, and we have to do a bit of research where our products are coming from. I would say in general, we should eat less meat. I think that's very clear, particularly less beef. That is clearly environmentally significant. But with a lot of the other products, it's actually where those products are coming from. It's part of a balanced diet. Even farmed fish can have very bad impacts on the environment, even though it's quite healthy. So we have to be careful, I think.
I'd like to remind our listeners, and probably this indicates my position, that there is a sort of in-between halfway house called vegetarianism as well. Now, the thing is that at the moment, the tropical forests probably play the greatest role in moderating the greenhouse effect and global climate change. But this is not necessarily the most important reason why we should conserve the rainforests. What are the reasons, apart, including this climate change, and to what extent are the forests important in regulating climate change?
Yeah, I mean, like as I mentioned, they're really critical environments in Earth systems. So you might have heard of this term that the Anthropocene is being used increasingly, which is used to define an era when our species is now having impacts on the Earth systems. These Earth systems can include the biosphere, so plants and animals, the hydrosphere, so water cycle, and things like that. But tropical forests really reach across almost all of these Earth systems and really are key to this definition of the Anthropocene, I would argue anyway. And so, on the one hand, in terms of biodiversity, tropical forests are home to over half of the world's plant and animal diversity. Now, that doesn't mean they're pretty to look at. It means that actually, if that goes, yes, it impacts tropical biodiversity, but that also means that half of our planet's biodiversity has gone. And actually, in current calculations, the rate of loss of biodiversity in the tropics actually is putting us on a trajectory that by 2100, we may have seen a mass extinction event of the scale, perhaps even larger than the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary. I mean, that is incredible. We are living an extinction event of that scale at this present point in time. So that's in terms of biodiversity. Tropical forests are incredibly important to that. You obviously mentioned the climate. In terms of the carbon cycle, they are huge carbon sinks, which means that a lot of the carbon is drawn in from the atmosphere. It stays there, that if it was released, it would cause much more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, greatly challenge our ability to keep warming below 2 degrees since industrial levels, and also lead to increased fire. You know, if that's lost by fire, it even increases the carbon emissions as well. So they're critical in terms of that too. And as I briefly mentioned earlier, in terms of their production of transpiration, the rainfall, if you lose these forests, you lose a lot of the world's terrestrial rainfall. I think they're responsible for at least over half, nearly 2/3 of the planet's terrestrial rainfall. And this links into climate systems. So actually, if you alter tropical rainfall, you alter rainfall across the planet as well, because of how linked in we are to everything. And so they are incredibly intertwined. And also, just finally, a lot of our food comes from the tropics. So our rice often comes from the tropics, or our coffee, or our tea. And so not only will this climate change impact the food we grow in North America or Europe or in the rest of the world, but it will also impact the yields of foods that we rely on from other parts of the world too. So I think we're in a period where they are going to massively, the change in the tropics are really going to start to have significant effects on all of us around the world. Even the spread of disease, right? Pandemics are seen as coming from, in many cases, tropical forest boundaries where humans are interacting with forests. Look at Ebola. So far, it's not too internationally transmissible, but if it is, that is a very nasty disease. COVID itself may come from the subtropical forests of China. So, you know, you start to see a world in which the role of the tropics is potentially very critical for what happens everywhere else.
You talk so much about agroforestry, particularly in the pre-modern era in South America. Do you think that a return to agroforestry methods of agriculture, considering that we are going to be dependent on the tropics to feed the world for the foreseeable future, would you envisage that agroforestry would be a good way to go?
Yeah, I think agroforestry has shown itself to be very important in terms of maintaining forest cover, but also maximizing productive food yields. I think it's interesting that in places in Africa, there's been this drive to replant forests to halt desertification, but also a lot of those forests have ended up being in agroforestry formats as well, that people can also, they're not just producing forests to replant them for climate, but actually also to use them economically as well, which is very important.
While we're coming to a close, why has the mass media ignored forests and the environment in general since the 80s, which is why maybe this level of destruction can take place? Why do you think that the media is ignoring it? I mean, everybody's talking about all kinds of things like racism and sexism and all kinds of topics like that, social justice, but a lot of this social justice doesn't apply to biodiversity. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the social justice is important in the sense that it's a lot of that has its roots in what happened in the tropics in this colonial period. Indigenous populations have been marginalized for hundreds of years since European colonialism as well. While on the face of it, they may seem like purely social issues, they actually do have impacts, particularly in the tropics, on knowledge and on management and on food systems. This is particularly significant with indigenous management, and so I think it does tie in together.
Well, I'm just talking about why has social justice not taken on board biodiversity? Biodiversity loss.
I mean, it's interesting. There is this term called the Plantationocene, which was sort of discussed in North America, which was used to define this period when plantations brought together, enslaved bodies, plants, and animals into a new tropical context and brought them together in this system of violence, really. And this theory was sort of used to highlight that this may have been one of the most significant periods or historical processes in terms of our interaction with the environment. It not only led to a lot of social injustice, but a lot of environmental injustice as well. And I think the tropics since the colonial period have really seen their people, their landscapes used to feed the wealth of Europe and North America in particular. And I think a lot of the international social and political issues stem from that, in terms of imbalances in wealth, in terms of racism, and in terms of these environmental challenges, which, sort of leave Europe and North America thinking, well, those issues are in the tropics. Why can't the tropics solve them? But actually neglecting the fact that it was a lot of, exploitation of the tropics that has actually led to their wealth in the first place. But also that climate change, in terms of who has been burning fossil fuels over the last 150 years, it is not really the tropics, almost negligibly the tropics. So even if there's impacts occurring in the tropics today, we have to accept that for 150 years, climate change and the current threats facing our planet are in the hands of a few. And so I think it's very important to acknowledge that. And we have to acknowledge the social, economic, and political sides of justice when we try and come up with conservation practices that are fair, that are just, because you have to also incentivize people actually you don't have to incentivize them. They know that they need to protect the tropics, but you have to give them support to do that as well.
Now, in the end of your book, you effectively ask your readers that they are part of the solution to helping to preserve and cherish the rainforests. But isn't it the case that most individuals feel quite helpless, and so much individual activity is quite passive? Don't you think that it is also very important for governments to get together, and that we have to have more politics enforcing the protection of the forests, and more international agreements? Or is that a reason that that kind of thing hasn't been happening quite so much as it should?
No, I think that's a good point. There are obviously all these things that individuals can do, but in isolation, they won't have such a big impact. But I think what I want to try and show is that individuals together can have big impact. So, for example, in the case of palm oil, a huge amount of pressure from European consumers, for example, managed to pressure huge firms in Europe and North America to adopting certificates of palm oil sustainability. So you can have an impact leading that together. I think also, obviously, in terms of our politics, we need to vote for people that have international concerns, right? If we only vote for national concerns, then that's not going to help the tropics. So if we care about an international solution, we recognize importance to an international solution, we have to obviously vote for people that also show that concern as well. So I think it's more, I suppose, about collective individuals together, but I think it does start at the individual level ultimately. But I agree, that we do need big change from governments. And I was reading something fascinating in the context of the Russian war in Ukraine, that the West has shown just how quickly it can change its economic system in a crisis. Why can it not do that for climate change? We know that it's a climate emergency. So why are we doing phasing out? Are we doing this when we've just shown that actually we can apply sanctions to businesses like that? And this needs to happen, actually, I think, for climate change. And yes, it might hurt, but actually, if we want to deal with the current situation, that's exactly the kind of overhaul that needs to happen. So I think that was a really interesting point, that we've seen that when Western governments care about something, they can do something. And so we need to somehow fight that they do that, as you say, to create these international agreements, to really create conditions where fossil fuel burning is no longer viable.
Now, you must have received lots of interesting feedback for your book, probably also from the tropics. You must be carrying on with your work to emphasize tropical forest conservation. What kinds of interesting feedback have you received that suggests space for optimism?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the nice things, so for example, we're working with some traditional owners in Australia, and they were just really happy to see the book because it showed an international perspective on other groups around the tropics that had been doing this, right? They've known for a long time that their traditional managements of tropical forests are important. But they really loved seeing this kind of broader perspective that showed that this isn't just the case in Australia, it's the case everywhere, and that indigenous knowledge should be supported there. So that was really nice to see, and I think increasingly interesting events being invited to architect events, for example, and urban planning with current urban planners, people designing our cities, having an interest in these cities that tried to combine more agrarian activities in with the urban landscape. So that's been kind of interesting, seeing the interest there from current planners today, and maybe taking up some of these ideas in the future as well. And yeah, so like I say, a lot of the projects now are really trying to apply methods like archaeology, paleoecology, to show how humans managed forests in the past, and to try and make some kind of difference today, to show how these practices can be significant for where we go from here, how there are different ways to live in tropical forests that can be more sustainable as well, but also to remind people that a lot of the issues facing the tropics, facing the planets, come from 500 years of colonialism. And we do need to take that into account when we try and combat some of these issues as well.
Well, yes, and I know that we're coming to the close now, but I want to say it's not just about us and the people. I mean, the flagship species that inhabit the tropical forests include the great apes, gorillas, chimpanzees, and orangutans. And you've also got the forest elephants of Africa. South America doesn't seem to have quite so many flagship species, but we could talk about the sort of like various dolphins that live in the Amazon. It's just quite important, isn't it, to consider these flagship species and the future survival of our entire civilization when considering the survival of the tropical forests.
Yes, no, definitely. These animals are crucial, and I think they're obviously the ones that we empathize most with because they're most like us. But there's also been, and this has also been shown how conservation even itself can fall into some of the same traps, because it often focuses on animals like those that are these big high-profile players, to the neglect of species that may, in some ways, be more important for the overall health of the forest. And so I think that's also interesting in considering where we go from here, considering each forest in its own terms. What do different species do? What are their roles in forest health? And how can they be integrated also into strategies where humans are still present, are still using forests? There's, in terms of those primates as well, there's a lot of programs where local people are incentivized to protect them because they might have ecotourism benefits, or they acknowledge that these animals are important for the health of that forest and seed dispersal. And it's about also supporting projects like that, where local people are taking it into their own hands to protect parts of the forest. But because of these global pressures, they also do need support to do that, because they obviously still need to be able to live, to make a living as well.
Well, in the light of the current levels of destruction happening that we hear about sometimes, would you like to kind of maybe make a short address without necessarily repeating yourself to the audience as a kind of final comment on the basis of this book and this discussion about future steps to be taken, or at least what the listeners should be considering?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in the century that's going to decide the fate of our species on planet Earth. It might sound dramatic, but I think it's true. It's the case in terms of carbon emissions, and it's the case in terms of our relationship with tropical forests. If our behaviors don't change by 2100, a lot of those forests, or most of those forests, will simply be gone, or they will still be disappearing as we've set into a process that they can't really recover from. What I would say is that based on our understanding of Earth history, those forests will probably come back. But the question is whether we will as a species. And I think we have all the evidence at our fingertips to show what we need to do, that it is possible to live with tropical forests, that we do know which parts of tropical forests that should be supported and maintained. I would also say that people in the tropics are coming up with policies. In Costa Rica, you have emissions taxes. In Africa, you have expansion of forest planting, but also agroforestry. The people in the tropics know that these activities need to happen, that they need to protect and find more sustainable ways to live with the forests. They are driving some of the most important conservation policies. And the question is, as consumers in Europe and North America, are we going to support those initiatives, or are we going to keep on with our consumption that is ultimately damaging the rest of the planet and is built on consumption that began in very imbalanced circumstances 500 years ago? Because if we don't, it's going to come back to our doorsteps, and in social, economic, political, and climate issues, it will slowly but surely impact our own societies. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, as you say, it's hard. Individuals can do something. It's hard. It might seem unfair to place it at individual doorsteps, but most important, we need to encourage our governments to take an international look, to take climate change, to take tropical forest sustainability seriously. because we know they can act when they want to. And so we really have to try and put on pressure to do that.
So Professor Roberts, thank you very much for your time, and I wish you well in your work.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.